welcome to this episode of the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Brian Lomax.
And I'm Josh Berger. And in today's episode, we're going to talk about a topic that actually came to mind as I was at a recent tournament. And this was actually an ATP tournament, the Monte Carlo Masters, that just recently took place, that I had the opportunity to attend, which I will say, if anyone has that opportunity to attend it, definitely take it, definitely go there, because it's first of all just a really beautiful place, really beautiful part of the world, and obviously really high level tennis. And as I was there and just following the tournament, leading up to it, and attending some of the matches, there was a theme that came up, and I think this theme is definitely relates to the types of feelings that a lot of players go through of every level: junior players, adult players at the USTA league level, college players, all sorts of players have probably experienced this. And this is the difficulty of closing out a match. And I think this manifested in two matches in particular. The first one being Diego Schwartzman against Stefanos Tsitsipas, which was the quarterfinal. And what happened in this match was Tsitsipas won the first set. He was up 5-3 in the second set, went to serve out the match, close out the match, and couldn't. He lost that game. He ended up losing the second set. And I think partly because of that, partly because of having not closed out that set when he had the opportunity to, he went down to a big loss. He lost 4 games in a row to start the third set. He was down 4-0, and Schwartzman was actually up 40-30. So Schwartzman was up 4-love, 40-30. And when Schwartzman was in this position, he couldn't close out the match, and Tsitsipas ended up coming back and winning that third set. So that was the first example, and the second example being actually the final, between Tsitsipas again and between Alejandro Davidovich Fokina, a young Spanish player. And in this match again, Tsitsipas is in a winning position, quote unquote. Went to serve out the match in the second set, couldn't, lost that game, was broken. Ended up winning that second set in a tiebreak though. But as Brian and I were talking, leading up to this episode, he asked me a question: what stood out? What was a theme that stood out? And that was, I would say, a big one. Number one, because it did happen, multiple times during this tournament, but also this is the type of thing that every player has experienced. I was saying, off air, I remember a practice match where I was up 5-0 and lost the next 7 games, where this can happen, where it. And I think we'll talk about some of the reasons why, because there's it always does take two to tango, and when one player's level drops, the other player's level can go in the opposite direction. But I think this is something a lot of players, most players, have experienced, in terms of that difficulty of closing out a match.
Well, first of all, Josh, I'm envious of your trip to Monte Carlo. That has been long a dream trip of mine, and I hope to get there someday, and I'm glad that you really enjoyed it. I'm also glad that we're talking about this topic because, first of all, you're using an example at the highest level of the game, and I'm sure that everyone listening has also experienced this. And so the good news is that we're all human, we all experiencing it. And so, today we want to talk about a little bit of the why, and then how to get through this better, how to become a master of closing, or at least get on the path to mastery of closing. Um, we've also seen and probably talked about the other side of this equation a lot more this year, especially with Nadal coming back against Medvedev in the Australian Open final, Nadal coming back against Sebastian Korda at Indian Wells. We talked about what the player who is in the losing situation needs to do to give himself or herself a chance to win. But we didn't talk so much about what Medvedev or Korda might have been thinking, and if there was some level of drop there. So it's just interesting that we're seeing this at the pro level, and so we want to make sure that we understand it. Um, in preparation for today, it made me think about, well, what are some of the other matches in which we've seen players really struggle to close? And then also, I wanted to think about who are some players who I think are really good at at closing matches, who play with courage and bravery in those moments. So when I thought about a player or an instance where there was maybe a choke or something like that, and many of our listeners who are a little bit, maybe more my age, 50s or more, may remember Jana Novotná versus Steffi Graf at the 1993 Wimbledon final. And Novotná was up 4-1 in the third set, and it appeared that she started to get tight. She had a double fault to lose the game and go from 4-1 to 4-2, and things started to unravel for her from there. But the other thing that I noticed in that match, and looking at the footage again, is that Steffi Graf saw that bit of weakness from Novotná, and it actually fueled her game. It gave her a little bit more confidence. As you just said, Josh, it takes two to tango, and very often in these situations, it's one player feeling the pressure to close and their game drops a bit, and then the other player having nothing to lose and they may increase their level. But I think there's another scenario there where the player who's losing is given a little bit of a lifeline by how the opponent is playing. And that's what happened with Steffi Graf. Her level clearly raised in that 1993 final, but I think it was spurred on by the fact that she saw Novotná getting nervous. And Novotná still had some good points through the rest of the match, but also had some really egregious errors, some balls that like flew into the back wall, some double faults that were out by feet or really low in the net, and it was just that little bit of drop and then Graf coming up, and that created that. So again, it's great that we see this at the pro level for all of us, is that everybody struggles with this. Everybody struggles with these emotions. They struggle with this tight feeling. And then, we want to talk about how to get out of it. And I think when I reflect back on some people who I think are great closers, and this is a player I've mentioned many times on our show, Monica Seles. So I wanted to go back and just see how she performed in three different finals. She won the French Open three times in a row: 1990, 91, 92. And the closing game that was truly impressive was the 91 final against Arantxa Sanchez Vicario. It was a long game. She suffered break points, but she also had match points, and eventually closed it out. The 92 final, she beat Graf 10-8 in the third. So another clutch performance at breaking at 8-all and then serving it out at 9-8. These are good things to go back and watch how bold and courageous she is in these situations. Clearly not waiting, although patient. So I think there's some good stuff to extract from some of those matches. So, Josh, how about we start to talk about what begins to happen in our minds as we're getting into that closing situation?
Yeah. So I would say, as the closer that you get to, closing out a match or winning a set, winning a match. And I think it's important to note that these same types of feelings can happen at the end of a set. Serving or returning at 5-2 or 5-3, 5-4, or another score in that similar position. It's very common, or most people will at least at some point start to think about winning. Okay, I'm up 5-3. I'm so close to winning this set. And what that does is it has a couple of different impacts. Where we talk a lot about the difference between focusing on the process and things within your control related to the process, like your attitude, your effort, your game plan, and focusing on those factors rather than focusing on outcomes. But when you're in this position where you're so close to that outcome that you desire of winning that set or winning that match, a couple big things happen. Oftentimes, a player can tighten up physically, where you start to maybe not fully accelerate your swing. You don't. You oftentimes players will hold their breath more. They're feeling more of those symptoms of performance anxiety in that moment, and not finish your swing, not follow through the way that they want to. So that can happen with the swing. Oftentimes players will stop moving their feet the way that they want to as well. Um, so I think that's a piece of it, the physical tightness that players can experience. But also when you're thinking about the score, um, you it you're also more likely to start to experience, sort of loss aversion, where you're trying not to lose rather than trying to win. This can be for different reasons, whether you're thinking about, the consequences of winning or losing the match, whether that means raising your ranking or raising your rating, whether that means a spot on your team, whether that's a certain position that you play on your USTA league team or high school or college team. Um, so, I think that's another piece of it too. So there's the physical tightness, and there's this loss aversion where all of a sudden, because of thinking about the consequences of losing, of not winning this set, you start to think about, what could go wrong, and start to play in a way not to lose rather than playing to win, and going to sort of like you're saying about Celis, playing in a way where she's aggressive and going after it. And I think it can be very common when players are in that quote unquote winning position, or getting close to the finish line, they start to back away and almost wait for the other player to go for it, because they don't want to have that courage, and they're not ready to take those chances that are necessary to play that style of aggressive tennis.
I think we see loss aversion in many sports. Um, think about soccer or even American football when one team has the lead and they start to, in soccer, they might just start to all fall back and protect the goal. In football, American football, they may start to just, again, the defense backs up and they'll let, the offense have a certain number of yards before they really start to bear down. And that can work. It often can also backfire in those sports, but it can work. And I think the added level of complexity though that tennis brings is, as you noted, Josh, there's no clock in tennis. In soccer and football, you can run out the clock and more or less survive that aspect of things. But in tennis, you can't. It has to be, you know pursued to completion with someone winning that final set. And so that makes it more imperative for us to know how to deal with loss aversion, how to deal with that tightness, which I think is really that tightness comes from some sort of threat response. You're detecting this situation as more of a threat to you than an opportunity. And I think when we think about loss aversion, the idea of that, we don't we're thinking more about what we have to lose and what we have to win. It doesn't even need to be like 100% we're thinking about what we have to lose. It's probably more maybe 60-40 thinking about what we have to lose versus the positive consequences of winning. But that's enough to change your body chemistry and perhaps kick in that fight or flight response that causes us to tighten up. Everything you mentioned is really a lot about our body chemistry changing in such a way that maybe there's more cortisol in our system, so we're completely reactionary. We're not seeing things as well. Our motor skills, our equilibrium are off now. And you mentioned that with the tightness maybe of your swing, the automaticity of or the flow of that breaking down, the ability to not move as well breaking down. So all these things are a sign of your body chemistry has been corrupted by what we're thinking about, and we're not in this moment. We're not thinking properly in terms of how to close out the match. We're thinking more about what we wanted to avoid, which of course is losing. And then there are a lot of things that go along with that. I was glad that you brought this topic up because in observing a lot of college matches as of late, I've seen this. I've seen players get tight in the moment, and for some it was because there were some big stakes, conference championship, playing a number one seed, things like that. For others, it was more about what will my teammates think if I lose? Um, will I be able to maintain my position in the lineup if I lose? And these are very powerful forces. And once a player gets into that state in a match, it's very difficult to get out of it. There's certainly some things that we can try, and we'll talk about those. Um, but it will require a radical shift in how you think when you're actually out there. And it won't be smooth and it won't be easy. It'll be a process. Um, but I think that you're dealing with that body chemistry and understanding where it comes from is very important to designing a solution for yourself and learning to master this process.
Yeah, I think that's a great point in terms of understanding that body chemistry, understanding that if you're feeling a certain tightness when you're out there, that can be interpreted in different ways. That doesn't have to be interpreted as in a negative way, as if, okay, I'm feeling tight, I'm done. I've been in this situation before and maybe it hasn't gone the way that I wanted to. Okay, I'm feeling tight, so I don't have a chance here. There are certainly some physical things that you can do in that situation to hopefully lessen some of the tension, right? Whether it's shaking out your arms and shaking out your legs, whether it's progressive muscle relaxation, where you go through, and this is something players can do off court as well to train this skill. But going through a process of tightening and loosening certain parts of your body, and sort of starting to become more in tune with where the tightness is coming from, and developing the skill to start to loosen up parts of your body as needed when you feel tight during a match. So that's a skill that players can utilize. But noticing this tightness, and again, there are certain things you can do about it. We also had an episode with Jeff Greenwald where he talks a lot about playing loose, and again about this same phenomenon of tennis players playing tight, feeling tight, and again, with just like this phenomenon of having a tough time closing out matches that every tennis player has experienced, also feeling tight, feeling that physical tension when you're playing, and mental tension to a certain degree, is something that everyone has experienced. And what Jeff talks about is using a scale, using sort of a 0 to 10 scale, and feeling that experience, or maybe 1 to 10, and feeling that experience of, what does it feel like to play really, really, really tight, and practicing, when you're on the practice court, playing some points that way. Okay, this is what it feels like playing as tight as possible. All right, now let's play a few points where I'm as loose as possible, sort of, almost not caring as much, almost, fooling around a little bit, almost getting to that level. And then, okay, if this is a 1 and this is a 10, what does a 5 look like? What does a 3 look like, or a 7? And being able to sort of move up and down on that scale. And then when you're in a match, trying to get to that point, and again, these things take practice, of being able to access that and being able to utilize, those different levels of tightness, of tension, and using that to your advantage, during a match. Maybe when you're going to serve for a match or close out a match, you need a different level of tightness or tension, right? Maybe you need to dial it back a little bit, where at other points in the match, you want to be a little bit more intense. So no, I think going back to this original point in terms of, what are some of the reasons for this, I sort of jumped ahead a little bit there and talked about some solutions, but I think another underlying cause of this is that, these sorts of situations can get us thinking of these situations as threats rather than opportunities. We've talked about this concept of opportunity versus threat a lot on different episodes of the podcast, and really any situation can be viewed in this way. Am I viewing this as a threat in terms of something could be taken away from me? Okay, I'm up 5-2 here. In some people's mind, they've already won that set. And you can view it as a threat, like, hey, I've already counted that I've pretty much won the set. I'm supposed to win the set, and now this person is coming back and close to tying the set up, let's just say. So you can view it as a threat, or you can say, hey, what an opportunity I have here to win the set, to win the match. Again, focusing on that process of what you have to do in order to get there rather than the outcome itself can go a long way. Focusing on, okay, what's my game plan going into this next point? Focusing on what does my intensity need to be like? How do I need to be moving my feet? Or what does my mindset need to be like? Um, Trying to maximize that time in between points, in between games, can go a long way to helping you do this. And using self-talk reminders and things like that can go a long way too. But I think when you're in this situation, and I think this is maybe where we want to get to in this conversation a little bit, but having a plan for the situation is going to be key in terms of spending time with a sports psychology professional, or talking to your coach and having a plan for how you want to handle the situation. And I think the more specific you can be, and we could talk about some specific things that you want to take into consideration and plan for, but the more specific you can be with that plan, the better.
I want to roll back to something you were covering there, Josh, which was some ways of handling. You're tight, you're in that moment, and some ways to work on relaxation, and right. So there's a lot of good stuff there about what you physically need to do using the scale that Jeff Greenwald talks about, and I think that's great for really lots of different things within the mental game of tennis. Is fantastic. I think we also want to add on to that, though, is what is happening cognitively. I think we need to attack the problem from both sides. And so when you're in that fight or flight response, that is a very powerful set of hormones going through your body that is not easily changed, right? That balance. And it's a moment where I think you have to try to move yourself from this fear of something, whatever it is, to excitement. And that has to be really strong. It has to be done in such a way that you're using your self talk like, yeah, come on, let's go. You can do this. Really strong motivational self talk. Um, you may also want to use a technique um, that I got from the book Chatter by Ethan Kross, which is in that moment, can you take yourself out of the problem? Like, because we're typically immersed in that problem, maybe talking a lot with first person, like, I can't do this, I'm so tight, I don't know what it's happening. And can you step out of that by using your name? You could say, I could say, all right, okay, Brian, here's what you need to do. And just by invoking your name and using second person in your dialogue there, it removes you a little bit from that situation, and you can start to talk to yourself in a more rational, objective way, and you can then use that more powerful, motivational self-talk to get you out. Because if you're just doing the body stuff, but the mindset or the mental attitude isn't where you need it to be, probably not gonna help as much. But if you can do both and really get yourself fired up to overcome whatever body chemistry balance that you have, you give yourself a chance there. And so I think that we want to make sure that whenever we're talking about some sort of problem we're trying to solve on the court, that there's a cognitive piece to what we're doing, and then there's a physical or somatic piece to what we're doing. And by combining those things, it makes the solution a lot stronger. I'm glad that you referred to that relaxation training, Josh, progressive muscle relaxation, diaphragmatic breathing. These are things that should be done off the court to help you learn to communicate with the different parts of your body better. As you noted, maybe you've got some muscle tension somewhere, but if you haven't practiced opening up the lines of communication between your brain and, say, your calves or your arm, you may not notice it. But through that relaxation training off the court, using progressive muscle relaxation or doing diaphragmatic breaths where you're consciously trying to relax yourself more and more, body scan meditations are also really good for that. Yoga is actually a great activity for that. It helps you just realize where tension in your body resides and how to let it go better. And those are, longer term solutions or techniques to help you. But once you get good at those things and noticing and bringing more awareness to how you feel, it becomes easier to release some of that on the court. But if you can combine that with great mindset, great thinking, better self-talk, like using your name and using second person to talk to yourself, we're really invoking there your coaching voice. So just imagine yourself, Josh, saying, okay, Josh, I know what to do right now, or you know what to do right now. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to start using your backhand. You're going to start doing this. And you give yourself a whole bunch of instructions rather than being immersed in this sort of downward spiral of, oh, I don't know what's going on. I'm so tight, which is what I have been hearing of late. Players saying, oh, my forehand is so tight. And there's a lot of I talk. And we've got to get ourselves out of that downward spiral, out of that immersion in the problem, and back to a place where we can start thinking of solutions.
And when you're thinking of solutions, when you're coming up with a plan, that's all about the process, right? That's all about that process of playing great tennis, that process of giving yourself the best possible chance to be successful, rather than thinking about the outcome and thinking about the score and letting yourself think too much about the fact that you're getting close to the finish line and close to winning that set or close to closing out the match. So I think that's great. And I like that, talking to yourself in that way and using your name and sort of giving yourself instructions in terms of being your own coach. We've talked on the show, and actually, Brian, you talked about this in your book, how in tennis you have multiple roles out there. That is not true in every sport, where you have to be the player, you have to be the coach, and you have to be the line judge, right? But I think that coaching role is something that maybe most players don't necessarily think about, where it's very rare to have a coach with you during a match. Yes, there are certain situations, maybe high school or college tennis, where you have a coach that maybe you have are able to talk to at times, or maybe in a set break and in very certain situations before a match tiebreak or something like that. But it's quite rare during a rain break. But it's quite rare. So that's a very key role that tennis players have to play in terms of being their coach, in terms of communicating to themselves in a way that's going to be most effective for reminding yourself of all of these things we're talking about, of having that plan, of noticing your symptoms of tightness and having a way to handle that, of noticing whether you're thinking a lot about the score and the outcome and sort of that future type of thinking, that what if I win this match, who am I going to play in the next round, right? That's something I hear from players. All of a sudden they're thinking about who they're going to play in a couple hours in the next round of the tournament, or the following day. Almost not almost thinking ahead and discounting that they've already won this match. So rather than getting into that future thinking, coming up with a plan, focusing on really what's important now. That WIN acronym. I know we talked about it with Jorge Capistani, and I think it's it's something I talk to players about, in terms of if you can have that thought, if you can think about WIN, if you can think about what's important now in between points or during a key moment in a match, it will direct your thoughts towards those process factors, like your attitude, like your game plan, like your like your physical intensity, like these sorts of things that you can really control and are going to give you the best chance going into that next point. Making sure that you're, I think especially during these moments, we talk about them being challenging. We talk about also how you want to be really using your in between point routine always, right? Making it automatic, making it just, this is what I do in between points. I take my time, I go through these various stages. But especially during these moments, if you're the type of player that maybe doesn't have a solidified in between point routine, or it's maybe more inconsistent, these are the types of moments where it's maybe most critical to be using something like that to slow things down, to have that plan for your serve plus one, or your return plus one, to have a clear intention going into that next point. And again, then you're focused on what you're going to do rather than what might happen, win or losing the match.
What's important now is also a really good strategy for trying to take yourself out of some unhelpful thinking. And so, one thing that came to mind, Josh, earlier, you mentioned someone having a 5-2 lead. And you've probably heard this. And someone will say, well, I always blow that lead. And one thing we're really good at as human beings is detecting patterns. It's something but sometimes we're a little bit overactive in that, and we're detecting unhelpful patterns or patterns that actually don't really matter in the moment. And, the fact that you have perhaps surrendered a 5-2 lead a few times in the past really doesn't have to have a bearing on this current 5-2 lead. And so using what's important now is a great way to step out of that and understand that just because I have had a couple of failures in this situation in the past does not mean it will happen again. But we have to recognize that a lot of these patterns that we detect are not necessarily real. Okay, yeah, that happened, but that doesn't mean it will happen every single time I have a 5-2 lead. So I think that's another issue that players will want to understand a little bit better. Um, so, Josh, how about we transition now toward helping players move along that path of how to master this process? We may never get quite to mastering it, but can we get to a place where we're doing well, say 80% or more of the time? And I'll start here a little with, and I think we're going to structure this kind of in terms of how we practice this in practice, then pre-match, and then what we're doing more in the moment. So when I think about moving along this path of mastering this process, it really has to begin as a process in practice. We have to not only play more matches um, and add more pressure to that, but we want to do things like study some of the best closers. What do they do? On the path to mastery, it made me think of Anders Ericsson and his study of elite chess players, right? Grandmasters. And what did they do more so than players at, say, the level just below them? And it was that they played more games and they studied chess more. So if we want to become that true master of our craft, reading about great players and how they close and what their mindsets are, watching some things. There's so many videos on YouTube of highlights now, even from the 80s and 90s. It's even some 70s. It's amazing how much tennis video footage there is on YouTube that you can go back and watch. So studying how these players have done it, watching them. And I know one thing that was effective for me, Josh, was planning out in practice what I wanted to do with respect to closing. So that when I got into that situation, I understood what I wanted to do. I understood the pitfalls as well, but I wanted to have a specific way of reacting. And I feel like the time that this really helped the most was a tournament I played in 2010. It was a big 40 and over final. And I got into a situation where I was up 6-3, 5-4, And I was really happy with how I played that game. Now, I did lose it. I ended up winning the match anyway, but I didn't play with fear in that game. And I remember getting here. It's like, okay, this is how you're going to play. You're going to hit your shots. You're going to put pressure on the opponent, etc. Um, and I was very happy with how I played the game, and I think that actually allowed me to still win the set, even though I lost that 5-4 game. My opponent just was tough. He was tough to put away. He was playing better. Um, but I think if we can all go into a match and practice how we want to close, have an idea of how we want to close, then it makes it easier once we get into that situation. Oh, I've done this before.
So let me ask you a question, Brian. Um, Imagine you were in that same situation and you served at 5-4 and you were broken and you smashed your racket or you started, yelling and getting upset about your serve. Oh, I can't serve and close out this match, or looking for some other sort of excuse, the wind or the sun or the opponent's calls or whatever it may be, rather than, okay, this happened. Let's regroup here. And let's give my opponent credit, playing a great game. Let's regroup here. What and maybe it's a rhetorical question, right? But thinking about the impact that has, and understanding the ups and downs that are inherent with tennis, understanding that you might not close out that match in your first chance, right? We talked about I talked about in the Monte Carlo final, where Tsitsipas served for the match at 5-3 and was broken, or 5-3 or 5-3 or 5-4 and was broken, and ended up winning the set in the match in a tiebreak. Also in the quarterfinal, right? Tsitsipas again against Schwartzman went to serve for the match in the second set, ended up losing that game, losing the set, going down by 4 games in the following set, but was able to come back. And we talk about some of these dynamics, how the dynamics of a match, the momentum of a match is constantly shifting, and now all of a sudden the other player is in that winning position or is up or has the chance to serve out the match, and and the opponent loosens up. So I think keeping all these factors in mind, it makes a big difference. Just your mindset going in, your perspective, also knowing that these things can happen. We talk about if these things can happen in Masters finals or Grand Slam tournaments, then yes, obviously they're going to happen even more so at the non-professional level. So knowing these things ahead of time, knowing that this happens to everybody, when it does happen, when you start to feel tight, if you get broken, trying to close out a match, being able to keep the perspective that, okay, this is not game over. This doesn't mean, I don't have a chance here. It doesn't mean, my opponent's just going to run away with this match now. I still need to, even more so than before, start really focusing on what I need to do, on, okay, what's my game plan, on maybe what adjustments I need to make, and go from there.
So it's an interesting question about what would have happened, and it makes me think about. I've used this concept, but we could also relate it back to the high standards piece, keeping your standards high, but compete level. So if I were to act in such a way like get negative, smash my racket, or just get tight and fearful, my compete level is harmed. And compete level is your ability to maintain controllables at a high level, regardless of what the score is, regardless of what is happening. And what you described there would mean that certain like emotional control would have gone down, maybe my focus would have gone down, and it's all based on the score, all based on what's happening. And that's something that I think as when we're transitioning to ourselves to become great competitors, you can't let happen. Um, Now I have the story about that too, Josh. I mean, I was up in one match. I think this was 1995, 6-3, 5-3, 40 love, and I blew 3 match points, and I did get upset. I took my racket and I frisbeed it into the back curtain, I tried to catch it afterwards because I knew it was my only racket after it left my hand. The other ones I had broken strings on. Um, and fortunately, it didn't break, and I ended up coming back and winning the set 7-6. But there was certainly a period of time there where I was off. Lucky enough to recover there, but there was definitely a drop in my compete level. That was a poor moment from a competitive standpoint. And so I think we just have to be aware, as you just said, of how we process what is going on the court. Um, and you said you're not out of the match, right? So if I lose my serve at 5-4, it's 5-5. I'm still in the match. And I had this situation with a player recently. She had been up 6-4 for love, and then it was 4-all. And I said to her at a break, I said, "Hey, if I told you before the match today that it would be you'd be up a set 6-4, and it'd be 4-all in the second, would you take that?" Said, "Yeah, I take that." That's what I need you to do right now. Doesn't matter how you got here. It's 6-4, 4-all. Let's play from here. That could be hard to do, but that is kind of that bringing it back to what's important now moment, and stepping out and say, all right, hey, yeah, I am in this match. I have just as good a chance to win this set as my opponent. Doesn't matter how we got here. Let me start processing things right now. What's important now? What do I need to do now? Um, and so I think it's a good and important question that you ask there.
And I like the approach that you took with that player, because it can be very hard to remember that and to keep that in perspective, that I am up a set, and deep in the second set, there's no reason I can't win these next couple of games and win the match. I think we talk about tennis being that a sport of instant feedback, where after every point you've either lost it or you've won it. And so you're sort of riding that emotional roller coaster, right? And when that set goes from 4-0 to 4-4, it can be very hard to think about anything other than those last four games that you just lost. So to be able to sort of take a step back, or have somebody else help you take a step back and sort of zoom out for a second, and sort of see things from an outsider's perspective and understand, hey, I am up a set here, and I have, it's 4-all. In theory, I have as good of a chance as my opponent to win the set now. To understand that, rather than being in that emotional state where you're focused on, having lost those last four games. So I think that's a really important perspective to help give a player, or talk through with the player. And I think I would also say that it's often easier to reflect on a match and to maybe understand that after the fact, that rather than in the heat of the moment. I think, again, going back to that time in between points, or going back to the changeover, your time during changeovers, where, when you're not playing points, whether it's an extended break like a changeover or set break, or in between points, that's really where you have that time, if used in an effective way. That's where you have that time to slow things down, to sort of get out of that fight or flight state in the heat of the moment, and come up with a response to the next point, which is the only thing we have control over. So if you can respond to the next point and come up with a plan, then you're not just reacting. Then you're not just using your instincts and just reacting based on how you're feeling in that moment. And how you're feeling in that moment, especially if you've lost those last few games, especially if your opponent seems to be coming back, could be less than optimal. So I think, again, as we think about responses here, using that time that you have, planning out having a plan, and using those moments in between points and in between games to slow things down, and to really have intention going into that next point or that next game, or goes a long way in terms of focusing on the process and playing in a really a process driven way, where you're focusing on those important controllable factors rather than letting the score get to your head.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think so when you're in the moment, and maybe you've practiced this, you've prepared for this with your pre-match routine, you want to have some sort of closing script that not only contains what you want to say, how you want to say it, but also contains the plays you want to run, or maybe the patterns that meet with your identity as a player that you want to go through there, how you want to handle yourself between points, as you're saying, Josh, as well as the emotions that you want to be experiencing, the body language that you want to be reflecting. And this can all be captured in some imagery or visualization. But I think it's one of those. I think this when we talk about imagery and visualization, it's easy to say, okay, visualize yourself playing well or doing all this. I think it's really important that we plan out what we want to visualize, especially for a closing situation. So that I think some of the categories that should go into that planning out should be the emotions you want to experience. Even though we use visualization oftentimes as the term, it's more than seeing. So that's why in sports psychology we often call it imagery because it's multisensory. But part of that multisensory piece is the emotional state, having the awareness of how you want to feel. So, and we're all a little bit different here, but for the most part, yeah, there ought to be some level of excitement or confidence or calm intensity. There's some sort of blend of that in there. You want to plan that out. You want to have specific self-talk things you want to say to yourself, and it could be a good opportunity to use that coaching voice, to use your name, to use you as the pronoun. You want to be able to understand what you want your body language to look like. You want to understand how you're handling that between point time. I like to have players take a little bit more time in that closing situation so that the game doesn't fly by so fast. Um, and then you want to break it down into patterns or serve return plus one type things so that you're seeing those things. And by putting all of this in a very planned way into your visualization, it's going to make it easier to bring that about in the match, to bring that level of excitement, to have that type of self talk. So by planning all that out and doing it in your pre match and seeing it, and I think these are things that if a player is struggling with closing, you need to do this daily for a period of time. Um, and even then, it's not going to necessarily be smooth when you try it on the court. But when you try it on the court and something good happens, you want to feast on that. You want to identify with that as, yeah, that's me. That's how I close, as opposed to getting consumed with, oh, that was so tight, and building your self identity as someone who can't close matches. Part of this process of mastery is we're trying to create a self identity as someone who's great at closing out matches rather than perpetuating this identity that I'm not good at it, that I always get tight, I always blow leads. And I think that that's a natural thing that we tend to do, especially as tennis players, is we over identify with our mistakes, our failures, our shortcomings, more so than we're identifying with what we actually want to be good at. And if you think about some of the masters of sport in any sport, we think of Michael Jordan, or Kobe Bryant, or Roger Federer, or Rafael Nadal. Other sports, have these masters as well. Um, they're so good at understanding what they're good at. They feast on the positive stuff of who they are. They've built their identity on what they do well. And they understand that what they do well is not just, oh, well, that's what is expected of me. Um, that's what they want to do. That's how they build mastery. And instead, they look at mistakes as just something as normal. They don't build their identity around that. Mistakes happen, and that's just part of the game. Losing points is part of the game, as we've said many times. They're not going to over identify with those things. They're going to more properly, look at the things that they do well and build their identity there. I think we want to make sure that as part of, you know, people who are listening, they start to build a more positive identity about how they close matches. And in the process of getting better at it, when you do something really well, don't just look at it as, well, that's what I'm supposed to do. Look at it as, okay, that's great. That's me now. That's the player I'm becoming. I'm going to build more of that, right? The more you identify with that positive, the more you're going to get of it. And so I think even as sports psychology professionals, us helping players transition from that piece of identifying with I'm not a good closer to getting to being a good closer, it's an important piece to see how people are building their own self image.
Definitely. Definitely. I think that that story that you tell yourself has a bigger impact in that moment. When the match is on the line, whether it's a tiebreaker, and right, we talked a lot about situations 5-2, 5-3, 5-4. It could certainly be in a tiebreaker, or as is more and more common now, a match tiebreaker up to 10, right? Maybe you're up 8-2, or 9-6 or something like that. And okay, you're just a couple of points away, but you have to cross that finish line. So I think that story that you tell yourself, about you as a closer, about you, the way that you finish matches, and those sorts of feelings and emotions that you want to have in that moment, and having a plan for that, it goes a really long way, especially during those key times. I think another important concept here is to try to be playing one point at a time. And we actually did an entire episode on this concept. So if you're interested, you can go back and listen to that. But really focusing on that next point. Um, the next point really is the only thing you have any control over. I think, Brian, you said it, and maybe other people have too. But the most important point of the match is the next point. Because it's the only one that you actually have any sort of impact over. You can't control whatever's happened in the past. You can't control what might happen. That next point, you can't control it, but you can impact and influence it. So when it comes to that next point, I think, calling your play and really committing to a certain pattern that has been effective up to that point in the match, and in your past. Maybe it's your favorite serve, or maybe it's your favorite serve and trying to set up your forehand, right? Maybe it's a return that you find really effective. People like, including myself, some people like to use the chip return on the first serve return. Just not trying to blow anybody away here, or even trying to win the point or be super aggressive, but let's get into the point. Let's get the point started at least and give ourselves a chance, rather than maybe taking that full swing and risking, and being overly risky. Let's chip the ball and let's get into the point. Or maybe it's a second serve return, and you're trying to, move around it, run around it, and hit your forehand and be aggressive with it. But having that plan, having that intention just for the next point, and focusing on one point at a time. Maybe, that example that you say, maybe your opponent has won a few games in a row against you, or it's in the match tiebreaker and you've lost the last few points. Being able to put that behind you and focus on that next point is going to be critical for giving yourself the best possible chance going into that next point. So I think having a plan, going to a pattern that has been successful in the past, focusing on that serve or return +1, really focusing on your intention for the start of the point, goes a long way there.
I think it's also, as we're calling plays and patterns and taking our time, it's important to know your own game and using your strengths there. This is not a moment to say get reckless and all of a sudden I'm going to just start hitting winners. We have to play within our game and understand how we put pressure on opponents. And I think there are different ways that we pressure our opponents. So consistency is one way that can be a pressure point. Using directionals, so moving people around. Depth can be a pressure point, keeping somebody back, or maybe you're pulling them in. So using that kind of dimension, lots of spin can be a pressure way. That think of Rafael Nadal and how much spin he uses. It makes the opponent probably hit the ball a little bit more imprecisely at times. And then of course there's power. Now you may not have all five of those pressure points in your game, or you may have all five, but know which ones that you're good at, and build your patterns, build your plays around pressure, putting pressure on the opponent. When we are stepping back and playing in fear, we go into more of a tentative style where we're hoping the opponent misses. There's no pressure there. We're not playing with purpose at that moment. And so it's in these closing situations that we want to play with purpose. We want to remember, we haven't brought this up yet, Josh. Remember, this is a fight. This is a combat sport. You are trying to essentially knock the opponent out. And we have to remember that that is the objective here. So when we're crafting these closing games, it is about the fight. It's about enjoying that aspect of tennis. We've talked about in different episodes what it means to be competitive. Wanting to win is only a part of it. You have to enjoy the battle. You have to enjoy the fight. And that is, I think, a key element to bring to these final stages of a match, is that I like this. I like this idea of battling someone. Yes, of course, I want to win. But the idea of engaging in this battle and coming out on top, hopefully, is really the part that gets me going. And I think too often players are overly focused on winning, and they think being, focused so much on winning is competitive, but it's not. If you don't enjoy this fight aspect of it, this battle aspect of it, closing will continue to be problematic for you because it's too much just about the result. You have to love that battle, the challenge of what is going on here. And you have to also love the fact that this will make you better in the long term. It's never about just one match. You're constantly working on yourself, your tennis project, becoming a better and better competitor as we go along. And if you can maintain those types of perspectives in your practice, in your pre-match, and then bring it to the court, how much you love the fight, you're going to, I think, close better. I know that has been really helpful for me as a player, just enjoying that battle, and I feel much better at the end, win or lose, because there's a lot of honor, I think, in that, Josh, as well, right? You're honoring the opponent by, in many ways, giving yourself 100% to the fight. So I just wanted to, make sure that people understand that aspect of it, but also understand you're playing with purpose and you're using these different pressure points that you're good at to help you close out these matches rather than just sort of hoping your opponent gives it to you.
I think that's a great point. Playing to win and going after it rather than waiting for your opponent to hopefully miss and give it to you. And also, I think embracing that aspect of this being a combat sport and this being a fight, and loving that moment, looking forward to that moment.
Yeah.
I think when you plan it out or you visualize it ahead of time, look forward to it. Be excited for that possibility that you might be in that winning position. And then when you're there, being able to access that, being able to remember, hey, this is the moment I've been planning for. This is the moment I've been looking forward to. And rather than letting that be something that stresses you out, okay, that means I need to win it right here, or I need to win this match, or I'm supposed to, rather than getting into those thoughts of expectations, those words like need to, supposed to, I should,
Yeah,
those
have
sorts of
to.
words,
Yeah.
have to, exactly. Rather than thinking about that, that's really where committing to your process, committing to those feelings that you want to have of excitement, of being driven and motivated, of really focusing on your game plan and on those first couple shots of the point is most important.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, Josh, any closing thoughts on closing matches?
I mean, I think we've covered a lot here. I would say again, and I know we've said this before, but this is something everybody has been through and probably will go through. If you're playing matches, there will be times where you go through this. It's not always smooth sailing when it's, when it's time to finish out a set or a match, or when you're getting close to that point, because you have to remember that your opponent is not more often than not is not going to just lose and take it. They're going to fight back. So I think knowing that and not being so hard on yourself in that moment. Again, if that match goes from 5-3 to 5-5, and you're able to keep your head and keep this perspective and understand, hey, this happens to everybody, including the best players in the world. I need to be able to maintain my composure here. And okay, now it's 5-5, and I need to have a plan for now. I need to have a good game plan. I need to focus point by point rather than letting that moment get to you and letting it go from 5-3 to 5-5 and being so upset about those last two games where you're focused on that and you keep looking backwards and looking at it with regret. And then you're not focused on what you have to do in the moment, on what's important now, on your process of playing great tennis. So I think, keeping those things in perspective really goes a long way, especially in those biggest moments.
And I think my closing thought would be also about keeping it in perspective and stepping back and looking at this as a process of mastery. That this isn't just about one match. Can we slowly look at closing as a part of our tennis project? Almost think of yourself. We're trying to all become like black belt competitors in the sport, and that is a process. So can we look at it from that perspective and not over-identify perhaps with some of the struggles, but understand we're on this path to getting better. We want to earn that black belt tennis competitor type of prize in the end. And the more that we can work on it in that way and think of these experiences as helping me to get better at it, the more you'll open up yourself to being successful. If we're just too immersed in the moment and our problems, it will be much more of a struggle for us, right? So, well, Josh, great conversation. Thank you for that, and thank you everyone for listening. If you have any feedback or questions for me or Josh, especially about this episode and any closing situations, you can email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. You can also use the Twitter hashtag tennisiq. Additionally, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube, so you can be notified of new episodes. Also, please check out our Instagram page. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.